Hey, yo, what's up, fellas? I got a comment from Eritrea here. Sammy, he's a TikToker. He makes a lot of content around Maoism and the country. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Sammy. I go by habeshmarxist on TikTok. I'm from Ethiopia and Eritrea. And I am a Marxist-Leninist Maoist. I live in England. So I could just run through them all really. So where do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So, for anybody who is completely unfamiliar with the country of Eritrea, where is it located? What are the languages and major ethnicities in the country?
So the Eritrea is a country in the Horn of Africa. It's right above Ethiopia. It's on the coastline. So it is a it's predominantly made up of, Tigray and Tigrayan people. That's, like, the predominant ethnicity. However, there are, like, 8 or 9 other ethnicities. But, Eritrea's kinda had to make sure that there's no tribalist splits. Like, unlike, for example, in Ethiopia or in, like, Somalia, Eritrea has kind of eliminated tribalism, which is one really good thing.
Okay, okay. So, all the major ethnicities work together. So, there's no like national chauvinism.
No. No, I wouldn't say that at all.
That's good. So
Um,
what are the
the
major
country
languages?
oh, it's, so, like, a lot of them speak Tigrayan, which is, like, a really big one. Um, and to answer, like, questions of religion, it's literally at 50% Muslim, 50% Christian. Um, Both Christianity and Islam have, like, massive, historical ties to Eritrea and just the Horn of Africa in general. So it wasn't really introduced by, like, the Ottomans or any sort of imperial domination. It was mainly just, like, there since a long time ago.
Okay. Eritrea recently got independence. What was the historical context for the Eritrean War of Independence? Why did it have a conflict with Ethiopia in the first place?
Um, well, so Ethiopia and Eritrea, they weren't always two separate countries. They used to be one big country, and it was known as like the Abyssinian Empire. So the monarch of that empire in the late 1800s, in the 1890s specifically, was a man called Menelik II, Emperor Menelik II. And so Italy has had like a history of trying to invade and colonize parts of the East Africa. And so then when they tried to invade Ethiopia, for another time, um, well, he to be honest, he didn't really want to fight the emperor, so he did this thing with Italian colonialists, and he signed a treaty called the Treaty of Wuchale, which basically states that you guys can carve out the top bit of the Abyssinian Empire, and you can just colonize that for yourselves. But as long as you don't step into my territory, you know, you're cool. You're cool. But just take that bit and go pay your dues and go. And so they were like, okay, that's fine with us. So they signed a treaty over it, and that little carved out piece of land is known as Eritrea today. And so as a result, Eritrea faced a brutal Italian colonial rule for years and years and years. And so eventually that was subdued. Um, and in the 1950s, Ethiopia reclaimed Eritrea officially back into and they absorbed it back into the country. So it became one country again. Um, and independence for Eritrea, like it mainly started by a guy called Idris Muhammad Adam in the 1940s. He was a massive kind of advocate for that. So he was what really led Eritrea to be released from Italian colonial rule, and so but eventually it ended up going back into the hands of Ethiopia. At the time, this was actually opposed by the Soviet Union when they went into conferences in the 1940s and this topic came up. The USA was saying because obviously they have interest in Ethiopia because they were an imperialist country, um, with ties to Western imperialists as usual. Um, they said we want Eritrea to be part of Ethiopia, and then Soviet Union disagreed. However, yeah, that happened, and so it was basically just like a totalitarian monarchist feudalist, backwards country. However, um, Haile Selassie, who was the king at the time, started sending over students from Ethiopia back to other Western countries like the USA and all in all parts of Europe. However, it was mainly in the USA that this happened. And when he sent them out to like advance in science and stuff, they came back with the ideas of like Che Guevara, Mao Zedong, because they got into contact with all these big like anti-colonial leftist movements in the USA, like the Black Panther Party. And so that was how the Ethiopian student movement was formed, and it played a massive role in Eritrean independence. And so the biggest ones were, this was mainly just to like overthrow feudalism as a whole, because there were massive famines back home in Ethiopia, which were caused by the monarchists. And so that really led a massive kind of protest towards the end of feudalism. So there were three main groups formed. One was Maison, the All Ethiopia Socialist Party. One was the EPRP, Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party, which was Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, and which was what my family were a part of. And then there was the EDU, the Ethiopian Democratic Union. Those weren't necessarily like communists at all. They were just like Western puppets. They liked Haile Selassie, but they thought that feudalism was bad and they wanted like a Western democracy after the overthrow of feudalism. And these were all massive groups in the 60s and the 70s. However, the key difference between Maison and EPRP was that although they were both pro-China and sided with China over the Soviet Union in the Sino-Soviet split, Maison was just a very chauvinist party, because they weren't advocates for Eritrean independence. They wanted to silence the movement. Bear in mind that this was around the 60s and the 70s, where Eritrean independence had already started having like a massive fighting stance, because organizations like the Eritrean Liberation Front were already active in fighting for Eritrean independence. So Maison was denying them independence. They were saying, we want Ethiopia to be this massive state, including Eritrea. However, we still want it to be communist and such. However, EPRP were Marxist Leninist Maoists, which was one difference, because Maison were Marxist Leninists only. And they also said that they wanted Eritrean independence and supported it wholly. However, such big leftist movements allowed a man called Mengistu Haile Mariam to rise to power to take over what's known as the Derg, because the Derg was a military junta regime that carried out the land reform, because there were massive protests saying land to the tiller to obviously sort out the peasant famines and to end feudalism. And so after the land reform was done by the Derg military junta, which was participated in by all leftist groups like Maison, EPRP, they were all in support of the land reforms. However, after they needed someone to take over the ideological clique, and so when EPRP and Maison, they went to West Germany to do like a little voting system, and Maison won. So they managed to get the kind of like priority lead over the Derg military junta temporarily. And so Mengistu Haile Mariam was a military officer who was a top general in the Derg. He was really good at what he did. And so he managed to rise to power and lead the Derg military junta. And so as a result, he managed to have a key role in what's known as the Ethiopian Revolution. And through him, the Soviet Union, got themselves involved, and obviously because they were following the Brezhnevite revisionist clique, um, when they were supporting Mengistu in the Derg, he essentially just killed off all of the Maoists, so EPRP, everybody. And these students were all tortured. They were brutally killed in horrible ways. At first, Maison supported this because they also had like a leading role in the military junta, because both of them supported no non-Eritrean independence, and obviously they were both Marxist-Leninist. However, Maison, because they were pro-China instead of pro-Soviet in the Sino-Soviet split, they ended up getting killed as well. So they just stabbed themselves in the back, um, because obviously the Brezhnevite clique wouldn't have, even if it had the same, idea about Ethiopian nationalism in this context, they were still siding with China over the Soviet Union in the Sino-Soviet split. So they had to go, and they would, because they thought they would be a nuisance and interfere with the Ethiopian revolution. So now Ethiopia has been taken over by what's known as the Derg, which is just a Brezhnevite Soviet-run regime, almost like what they did in Afghanistan. Um, so yeah. Meanwhile, while all of this was happening, in the 60s, the Eritrean Liberation Front arose, and it was like an armed resistance fighting for Eritrean independence. And it was mainly run by what's known as Sawaso, which is the Labour Party, which were Marxist Leninist. So it was already a communist movement in the first place. And at the time, this was before the Ethiopian Revolution in the 60s, and this was around in the 60s. They were supported and trained by Palestinian Liberation Organization, Syria, South Yemen, um, other like big socialist states like Cuba. Yeah. However, um, they got into contact with China in the late 60s, and Mao Zedong took in Eritrean generals and leaders. Top five. First, it was five military kind of top cadres. Um, and out of these five, the main two I'm going to be talking about today are Ramadan Muhammad Noor and Isaiah Afwerki. And so he trained them on People's War, on the fundamentals of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. He trained them on all of these things. And so when they came back, the Eritrean Liberation Front wasn't, although it was, ran at the core by Marxist Leninists, it wasn't really a trained proper vanguard with a true ideological clique. And so Isaiah Afwerki and Ramadan Muhammad Noor, along with a few other comrades, started a proper vanguard, a Marxist Leninist Maoist vanguard in the 70s, and that's known as the Eritrean People's Liberation Front. And the People's bit was to signify the active self-protracted people's war being implemented into the Eritrean movement for independence. Hmm. And so um, the ELF, although they were Marxist Leninists, they also had a problematic uh, stance that the Soviet Union, they're still a good force, but they just ended up siding with the wrong people in the Horn of Africa, and they ended up supporting Ethiopia, right? Now this is a key thing we're going to go through later. And so let's go to the late 1970s, early 80s. So now the EPLF and the ELF have signed a contract, and they're saying, look, although we may have some differences, we're going to have to fight together to both achieve Eritrean independence, right? However, uh, people like back in North America, the Eritreans for Liberation in North America, which were a hardline Maoist movement, they encouraged the EPLF to take a more strong Maoist, you know, a stronghold. And so the ELF, as well as that, the ELF were also trying to make talks with the Soviet Union and Mengistu and try to make peace deals. And obviously, the EPLF couldn't have this because that would interfere with the Eritrean liberation struggle. And so, in the and what started in the very very late 70s, but mainly in the mid 80s, there was a massive civil war between the ELF and the EPLF, um, to which the EPLF won. And so, as well as this, people who were also a key force in the role for Eritrean liberation were what's known as Malilit. It was a Marxist-Leninist League of Tigray, which arose in the Tigray region, and it was started by a man called Meles Zenawi, and it was a hardline Hodgist movement um, to resist Soviet revisionism inside Ethiopia. And so Malilit, which was the organization running what's known as the TPLF, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, TPLF and the EPLF joined up, and then eventually in 1991 they successfully overthrew the Derg military junta and Mengistu Haile Mariam. However, unfortunately, the TPLF dropped the Marxist-Leninist kind of ideological clique after 1991, unlike the EPLF with their Maoist clique, unfortunately, and now they are puppets of American imperialism. But yeah, that's essentially like the general view behind the Eritrean independence movement.
Okay. Who were the major figures of the Eritrean War of Independence? I think you sort of already went over them, but what happened
Yeah.
during the Eritrean War? of independence, and what was the nature of the Derg regime? I know you also have some family history with this, so that experience are firsthand, so maybe you could thread some of that in there.
Yeah, 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 sure. So for the Eritrean independence movement, the two main people we're really going to be talking about Muhammad. Oh my God, his name is like a tongue twister. Ramadan Muhammad Noor and Isaiah Safawerki. Ramadan Muhammad Noor was genuinely, I think, in my opinion, one of the greatest Marxists of Africa. He was the whole creator behind the Vanguard and the Maoist ideology behind it, as well as Isaiah Safawerki. Um, uh, and then with the Derg regime was like it was run by Soviet revisionists. And if you see what happened in Afghanistan, for example, and like the Maoists in Afghanistan and stuff like that, as well as how the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan was run at the time, it's very, very similar to Ethiopia, almost that identical. And so, although I disliked like the toxic Ethiopian nationalism and the revisionism, my mom, who lived under the Derg regime, had told me that the Cubans and such they provided really good healthcare, and East Germans as well contributed to a really great education. They did do good things, like for example, introduce prosthetics in the field of obviously like doctorate medicine and stuff like that. They did provide some really, really good things. Because the problem that I really do have is that and this is I see this in a lot of Ethiopians, is that when they talk about the Derg regime, instead of demonizing the toxic parts of it, like the chauvinistic Ethiopian nationalism, they demonize socialism as a whole and such. And I think that's bad because we also have to see the good in some socialist regimes, even if they may be revisionist or even if they may be toxic in some parts. And I think it's just ignorant to, denounce all of it.
Okay. I also know your father was involved in some political activity. Does he have any?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Um, Ooh, he actually fought in the land reform in the mid 1970s in Ethiopia. And it was like he was really a really big part of the Ethiopian student movement and the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party. He actually went to the West Germany along with my uncle to represent the EPRP against Maison. Um, so my dad, but obviously because like the EPRP, which were a Maoist party, were going through massive like persecution in the late 1970s by the Derg regime and by the Soviet revisionists. Um, he had applied for a scholarship to Princess Diana's the school that she went to in Kent, and it's called Sevenoaks, and he actually got accepted. So he went to Kent to go and study for the rest of like his secondary school, as you guys would call it, like high school education. And so he when he first came, he didn't really know how to speak English very well. And his like when he first came, he did like a massive assembly on communism. He said it in like a really, really thick, like freshy accent. So everyone just like laughed at him. It was quite funny. And so what else? Well, my dad was at that school, obviously because the British and other imperialist powers supported Ethiopia, especially under its monarchist rule and its persecution of Eritreans. Because my dad is also Eritrean, um, Prince Charles, well now King Charles, but at the time Prince Charles was going to visit Sevenoaks School, and because my dad was a prefect there, he was the one who was in charge of like greeting the visitors. However, my dad refused to because obviously he was against the monarchy and he was against their imperialist nature. And so the school and all like the school students, they typed up a newspaper about him and it was released and it was called like Ethiopian Marxist rebels the royal family or some ridiculous thing like that. Yeah,
Absolute Chad. Absolute Chad. Okay.
facts.
So going back to the Eritrean War of Independence, what happened during it? And what year did Eritrea get its independence?
Um, so Eritrea officially got its independence in 1991. And it was mainly because obviously due to the collapse of the Soviet Union, their military force, especially of the Derg, was like very, very limited and hindered. And obviously because the TPLF and the EPLF, because they used protracted People's War, and because Ethiopia had like a majority peasant population, especially in the northern parts where they were operating at, they managed to utilize the peasantry and they managed to get overwhelming support from the majority of the people. And so that's really how they managed to overthrow the Derg regime. As well as that, Mengistu also stopped getting as much arms because obviously the Soviet Union, which is one of the reasons why I dislike them, especially under the Brezhnevite clique, when they worked with like African regimes and such, they always kind of debt trapped them actually, because Brezhnev essentially just debt trapped the hell out of Mengistu, and he was in like billions in debt. So in 1987, the Soviet Union just ended up dropping him, and they said, "We're not going to send you any more arms. Just good luck, pal." And they just kind of left him. Yeah, and that
Okay.
really hindered Mengistu.
Would you say the Derg was not ran well overall? Was there a lot of corruption, or what exactly were its biggest problems?
The Derg's biggest problems. Okay, so I don't. Hmm, that's like a very interesting question because the Derg, I don't think it was ran very well. I think it was a very opportunist government, and I feel like even Maison would have done a better job at running Ethiopia than the Derg because Mengistu, especially him, just as a leader overall, it was a very opportunist rise to power. He only managed to get in power because he just so happened to be a rising general who was doing well in the Ethiopian army. He didn't really know much about Marxism Leninism, and it's come out that he wasn't even like a communist in any way. He said that like, oh, if the West would have supported him, then he would have followed the Western clique. If it was the Soviet Union that supported him, which it did, he would have followed the Brezhnevite clique, and that's exactly what he did. He was an opportunist, and that's exactly why he had no morals, and so he also behind although while the Soviet Union was telling him to spout pro-Palestinian rhetoric, he was actually receiving bombs from Israel, multiple bombs from Israel to go and bomb Eritrea with, and that's exactly why Eritreans exposed Mengistu in multiple articles, which you can find on Marxists.org, about him receiving support from Zionists too behind everyone's back.
Okay, so overall, the Derg was very opportunist, terribly national chauvinist, also in terms of its treatment of Eritreans. So the EPLF, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, that's what
Yep.
it's called, right? Yeah. So
Yeah.
they get independence. How did their plans change at all before and after the revolution? I mean, obviously, you always have different plans before a revolution, and after a revolution, you
Yeah.
have to always deal with,
Yeah.
the getting into power.
Yeah. So this is interesting because with the TPLF, which were Hodges, when the Americans came after, they were like, "Oh, you Marxist Leninists." They're like, "Oh, no, no, we're not Marxist Leninists. No." They kind of just dropped it, and played their little facade. But with the EPLF kind of tricked the West. So they said, they moved out of the era of the Vanguard and they transformed the Vanguard into a party um called the PDFJ, which is like the Party for Democracy and Justice. It's the current ruling party in Eritrea. So it wasn't like explicitly Marxist Leninist or Marxist Leninist Maoist, but we can see that it operates as such in modern day Eritrea. And it was mainly because if they just went out and openly said we're Maoist, right? Or we're communist to the United Nations when they were establishing their independence, or to America or whoever, their force would instantly just have been crushed, right? They knew that they couldn't establish a secure national liberation and a secure socialist Eritrea if they did such instantly and right away. So they managed to kind of hide it away a bit by transforming the EPLF Vanguard Party into the PDFJ.
It kind of reminds me almost. I mean, it's not a one to one, but it's very similar to Mandela's ANC, which was very very radical. But then, like around the
Yeah.
'90s, it appeared, it reformed itself to be a little bit more liberal seeming to just appeal to the West and things like that. So you would say it
Yeah,
was mostly like out of survival because the Soviet Union's gone and China's now on
yeah,
the longest
yeah,
path. And
yeah.
okay.
And so because because obviously those big communist powers were kind of gone, um, Isaias Afwerki, um, because obviously, like, Cuba followed the, Brezhnevite clique and sided with with the Soviets in the Sino-Soviet split. They went from supporting Eritreans to helping and openly, spouting pro-Ethiopia, pro-Derg rhetoric, um, against Eritrea. However, Isaias Afwerki has made an effort. Who's the leader of Eritrea currently, by the way. He made an effort to reach out to Cuba, especially in the early 2000s. He openly said that he admired Fidel Castro and his struggle for the workers, and he um he made an effort to try and reconnect with them after, because obviously, even though Cuba sided with the revisionists and they did make mistakes, they are still a prominent socialist state today, and Isaias Afwerki and Ramadan Mohammed Noor believed that they should still try and make a connection with them. And so as a result, Cuban doctors were sent to Eritrea and they helped recover Eritrea. Obviously, because it was massively destroyed and distraught after the War of Independence, and yeah, they supported them in many ways, especially in healthcare.
Does the destruction from the War of Independence still affect Eritrea, or has it recovered well?
I'd say it's recovered fairly well. There's not really much left over from it, which is really causing a massive problem.
Okay, okay. So what are the biggest misconceptions about Eritrea? Because like, if I type it into Google right now, the first thing that I get is like literally a mud hut. Like it doesn't seem developed at all, according to like
Yeah.
Google.
Yeah. Eritrea is actually quite developed. They just don't want you to know that. Because Eritrea has pushed away Western imperialists and said, we're not gonna have this, we're not gonna let you invest, take parts of our agriculture or anything like that, or our resources. They try and like spout propaganda against it, you know. But it's complete lies. Number one, the main lie is that if you go there and your name sounds like you're from a certain ethnicity, or if you just do any little thing wrong, they'll kill you and execute you. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Like, all my friends go there constantly. From my friends from Eritrea, they go there constantly to go and visit relatives. They come back completely fine. Um, like, most of the lies that you'll hear about Eritrea are just like outright ridiculous. They'll say they don't have electricity or that they don't have like simple Wi-Fi, and it's just ridiculous. They have all of those things.
Okay.
Um,
Because it's sort of called the North Korea of Africa, are there a lot of like myths spread around it within like African news and things like that?
Pardon? Wait, could
Uh,
you repeat that again?
because it's called like the North Korea of Africa within the African world, are there a lot of like crazy stories spread around it, like similar to how we get crazy stories about North Korea all the time?
Oh, that's interesting. I think it's called African Stream, right? That news source.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, the one who got accused for being pro-Russian or whatever. They've actually on multiple occasions, praised Isaias Afwerki and Eritrea, and you'll see that a lot because obviously the Western-backed sources in Africa will try and demonize Eritrea and like people like Ibrahim Traore. However, you'll see in the proper African news sources that try and give you true news as to what the West does in Africa, you'll see that they are fond of Eritrea.
Okay. Are there any other big misconceptions about Eritrea you want to address?
Yes, one of them is that Eritrea supports Israel, and it's usually because a lot of ELF members or like people with ties to the ELF are salty that they lost the civil war, so they just try and like they're now like a puppet of the West, and they try and spout this like they try and like manipulate modern day situations, and obviously because Israel Palestine is a massive one, they'll try and say Eritrea supports Israel. And for some reason on Wikipedia, some guy with like no citation at all wrote that Isaias Afwerki went to Israel in the late 90s to receive medical treatment, which is just a complete lie. You'll see that um on articles written by Eritreans, especially on Marxist.org, throughout the Eritrean War for Independence, and the fact that they received support from multiple Palestinian resistance groups and fighters and politicians, you'll see that it's completely illogical and there's no actual proof for this. So that's a complete lie.
Okay. If you search up Eritrea's government, the first two things you get are dictatorship and totalitarian. How does the government structure of Eritrea work? And do you believe that it's a democracy?
Yeah, I do genuinely believe it's democracy. They have like they have a similar Soviet style democracy. So they have in terms of like parliament. Um, so really, when they say a dictatorship, they call the Soviet Union, which had a similar style of democracy to current day Eritrea. They called that a dictatorship too. But you really have to think about it. Who is it a dictatorship of? It's a dictatorship of the working class. And the Eritrean government actually provides, as you'll see in every socialist state, they provide, you know, benefits for their people. They give them free healthcare, completely free healthcare, which successfully managed to eradicate all prominent diseases in other African countries that were present in Eritrea. For example, polio, especially in the late 90s. They provide free education for Eritrean students, and there is a lot of social housing which has been newly built by the Eritrean government, especially, and which has been built throughout their rule entirely, actually, for the citizens. So I believe that it has many similarities to other existing socialist states like Cuba. However, because it's going through things like massive embargoes, and Western sanctions, obviously some of their progress and some of the things that they're able to provide are going to be hindered or limited by that. And so people may try and, twist that as to seem like the Eritrean government is just choosing to do that.
Okay. Obviously, a lot of economies and socialist states had to implement in some forms of liberalism or markets into their economies after the collapse of the
Yeah,
USSR. Cuba, Vietnam, things like that, et cetera, et cetera.
yeah.
To what extent has Eritrea remained socialist? Would you still call it socialist? Has it introduced in some market reforms in order to survive,
No,
or does it maintain a very strong socialism?
no, I don't think it really has, especially it has probably done like in the most minor way possible. So obviously because of the historical ties between China and Eritrea and Mao Zedong being a massive aider in the Eritrean liberation struggle, they've allowed China to slightly invest in Eritrea, but apart from that, they've still remained completely self-reliant and frequently spout the rhetoric of, self-reliance for Eritrea and self-reliance for Africa. Um, like for example, if you see in WikiLeaks documents, which are like leaked American government documents and CIA reports, you'll see that Isaiah Afwerki and Ramadan Mohammed Noor in the 2000s went for a dinner party with Chinese government officials, to which his eyes just straight up denounced Deng Xiaoping, and called him like a traitor and said that Mao Zedong is like he's the main reason why China is successful today and why China has became like industrialized. He just went on a massive rant about like just loving Mao and hating Deng, and he frequently refutes books offered to him by Chinese government officials on why Deng Xiaoping is good and how he helped China and such. Yeah.
Okay. Well, what does Eritrea's economy look like? Is it fully socialist? Is there like some private investment in there?
Um, there isn't really much private investment in it. The only
Okay.
private investment you'll see is like minor investments in agriculture from China. But as I told you before, that's only because they view China as like a historical ally, and obviously because Eritrea is like a tiny little nation in the Horn of Africa, which is surrounded by um Western backed and imperialist puppet states like Ethiopia, which are constantly trying to antagonize it. They have to have some sort of support in some form. And although I don't agree with working with China as they are social imperialist, I think that Isaias knows that they're social imperialist, but he believes that there's no other way to keep Eritrea alive, because if they didn't, then they would just completely be defenseless, and they would have to succumb to imperialist powers around them.
Mm. Uh, what have been the biggest successes of Eritrean independence and socialism?
Eritrean independence and socialism, I would say one which I've already mentioned before, which is eradicating all the African diseases which you'd see in other countries surrounding them, like polio and such. They eradicated that in Eritrea very quickly in a matter of a few years. Um, they've massively raised the literacy rates from like minimal numbers to over 70%, through institutions like free education. It has a high home ownership rate, obviously because of a lot of the social housing that they provide for their citizens, specifically in regions around like the Masawa region, which has a lot of social housing. Um, and they have implemented socialism to the point where it's provided so many good benefits for the people that it does better than all the neighboring countries around them. For example, Ethiopia, they have higher literacy rates than Ethiopia. They have higher, caloric intake, and they have higher home ownership rates, etc., than Ethiopia. Although the West would not like to let you know this because they obviously try and promote pro-Ethiopia, anti-Eritrea propaganda.
Okay, and all while sanctioned too. That's crazy.
Yeah,
Um, so where does Eritrea sit internationally right now? Like, who are its biggest allies? Who are its biggest enemies? I'm guessing probably like Ethiopia and America, right?
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
definitely, yeah. So
And
it would be.
how does it participate in like the global economy? Like, how limited is it because of sanctions?
Oh, yeah. So, hmm, yeah, but they are in, allyship with what's known as obviously BRICS. So they are in BRICS. They were one of the first they were one of, like, quite the early members. Um, they have a fairly good relations with Cuba, which started in the early 2000s by reaching out to Fidel Castro. Um, in the, kind of they also had, ties to Iran, and they have relations with Iran to some extent because, Eritrea was involved in the persecution of states like Libya and Zimbabwe during the war on terror in the late 2000s, um, which Ethiopia launched against Somalia, and Eritrea was accused of funding the Somali terrorists and working with Iran and supporting Hamas, all these ridiculous things. And so, yeah, those are the kind of people that they're currently working with, other anti-imperialist states, which are kind of trying to form an alliance. Um, in terms of economically, um, especially exports into Eritrea, if you look up sanctions on Eritrea and embargoes on Eritrea, one of the main things that you'll see is that there is a lot of like hindrance to exporting things into Eritrea, and so it makes them hard for them to gain many of the essentials that they need to function properly as a society.
Okay. What about the Sahel states? Do they have good relations with those?
The Sahel states.
Yeah, the Sahel Confederacy. Burkina Faso.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. 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 Oh, yeah. Yeah. Um, there hasn't really been a lot of discourse about it. However, if you look up on African Stream, I do remember that they made like a report saying that to some extent, Burkina Faso and all these other arising kind of anti-imperialist states in Africa were inspired by Eritrea because Eritrea has kind of been like the main one. Isaias is like the OG of this shit. Um, he's been the main one, kind of spouting an anti-Western rhetoric and rhetoric of self-reliance, and so that kind of almost inspired people like Ibrahim Traore.
Okay, so the way I understand it the best is Eritrea got its independence during the collapse of the Soviet Union and
Yep.
I guess reforms in China, and it sort of found itself a nice niche where it was able to keep enough of its socialist vision while still like accommodating all these new contradictions of like a post-Soviet, post
Yeah,
dot
yeah.
world. Yeah.
I would definitely say that. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. What can socialists learn about the lessons from Eritrea and Eritrean independence?
I would definitely say main thing you can learn about the Eritrean independence movement is number one, never be afraid to go against the party. Never be afraid to go against the party. For example, because if Isaias and Ramadan Muhammad Noor had never contradicted the so-and-so Labour Party and the ELF and their arid kind of views on the Soviet Union, they would have never actually properly acted out protracted people's war, and they never would have gained support of the masses. So never be afraid to go against the party if you view that they're doing something wrong, and just because the majority of the party disagrees with you, doesn't mean you should be afraid to speak out. Secondly, I would say one of the main things that you can also learn from the Eritrean independence movement is that the masses are your friend. We see this in Lenin. We saw this with all of the big leaders. Is that you have to utilize the masses if you want a revolution. If the Eritreans and if the Tigrayans do not utilize the masses, especially the peasantry, by using self-reliant protracted people's war, they would have never been able to overthrow what's known as one of the most powerful military juntas in the entire continent of Africa at the time. And so I think those are the main big reasons that you can learn from Eritrea.
Nice, nice. Do you have any more family stories or personal stories about Eritrea, Ethiopia, students in America that you want to share?
Mm, let me see. Um, Yeah, I suppose like my mom, from what she saw, the Cubans were so, although obviously they were acting on the wrong side in this case, they were always so like wholesome. Because obviously Cuba is kind of known as a third world country along like Ethiopia. When they worked with the poor so well, like you would always see the Cubans like dancing around with the natives and making connections with the natives, and it was really wholesome, like a really wholesome connection to see. And so that was mainly like what she'd seen. She always had fun encounters with them.
Okay. Nice, nice. Sammy, where can people find you? And if you if you have any final words, let us know.
Yeah, bet. So if you want to contact me or anything, you can find me on TikTok at habeshmarxist. Um, yeah,
Marxist, Leninism, Maoism, Eritrea, good. Any final words?
facts. Um, I would say, any final words? I would say People's War is universally applicable, and Mao rocks. So that's it.
What the fuck? Glory to Stalin. I barely made it.